Okay, so hello guys and welcome to another video in this series. And this time we're going to look at the Greco Gambit as it's played nowadays, which is the modern line, where in fact it's not a gambit at all, to be honest. It still keeps its name, but as we will now see, after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, pawn to c3, knight to f6, pawn to d4, we saw that the traditional Greco Gambit in the last game is to capture on d4, recapture, so let's just see there, c takes d4, and now we saw all the problems that white had in proving an advantage after the very strong check on b4. So because of this, modern players play an intermezzo move, and that move is pawn to e5. Now here, the knight is under fire. So black has in the past tried moves such as knight to g4 or knight to e4. The problem with knight to g4 is that although it attacks this pawn here on e5, white can simply defend it with the bishop on f4, and then this knight on g4 is badly placed. Black might castle, but after pawn to h3, the knight doesn't have many squares except h6, and here white can actually take, and after pawn takes, we see that once again black's structure is ruined, similar to one of the variations in the last video for those of you who saw it. So because of this, we don't, black generally tries to avoid knight to g4. If instead of knight to g4, black chooses to put his knight on e4, then in this case, white can harass the knight with bishop to d5. And the black knight has nowhere to go. f5 is a very bad move because it's opening up the king, and after pawn to f6, we see that the black king will never castle, and the e-file is going to be very open. That's going to be very dangerous because white can castle and play rook to e1. So black is struggling for a move, and in fact here black's best bet is to capture on f2, and we will take a look at this in our model games section. This is known as the sacrifice of the Ghulam Qasim variation. It's not as crazy as it looks, but nevertheless it's objectively not the best try for black. So instead of this, black plays what is a very thematic move. If you're an e4, e5 player, you should know this typical response against an advance to ignore your knight and to counterattack and strike at the bishop on c4, and of course make your claim in the center, right? Put that pawn in the center. Now the first thing to point out is that if white captures here on f6 and black takes on c4, even though after taking on g7, the white pawn has gotten very, very far, and it might look really dangerous for black. In fact, black has the bishop pair, a great situation in the center, and as it turns out, this is not scary for black at all. So therefore, after the move pawn to d5, white usually just moves his bishop. There are two main moves that white can play here. The main move by far, the most popular by far, is bishop to b5, pinning the knight to the king. However, there is also a possibility, and in fact, the very last game of chess that I played, I faced an opponent who played the bishop back to e2. This is also a reasonable choice. But here, black can either continue normally with knight e4, and after pawn takes d4, simply drop the bishop back and argue, when comparing this to the main line, argue that the bishop on e2 is not quite as well placed as on b5, where it threatens to capture here this knight on c6. Or what black can also do is he can take advantage of the fact that this bishop here is on e2, and he can, rather than play the move knight to e4, he can play another intermezzo, pawn to d3. Now, if you capture this knight, I will capture this bishop. We won't go into the details of this variation, but all you need to know is that after pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, queen takes pawn with check, black can simply play king f8, and once again, it may look as if his king is very weak, but he has the two bishops, he has a central pawn, and the situation is actually better for black than it appears at first sight. It's probably something around equal, so white does not have any major advantage here. Okay, so instead, after the move pawn to d5, what white usually plays is he puts his bishop on b5. Now black finally has to do something about the attacked knight. He puts it on the central square, although it is possible to bring it to d7. Puts it on the central square, this is the main line. And here white recaptures. It makes sense that this has become the modern line because white does not gambit a pawn. Modern chess players are very greedy and they will only give a pawn if they know for a fact that they have full compensation. So once we realize that in the other traditional lines, there's a lot of speculation there. Once people realize this, mainly by using computers in addition to their human analysis, they stopped playing that altogether at the highest levels, and instead they keep their pawn. And white is trying to claim an advantage because he has two central pawns here versus only one for black. Black must now do something about his bishop. Bishop b4 check is an option, but bishop to b6, continuing to pressure d4, is the main line by far. After bishop b6, white decides that yes, he has great control over the dark squared portion of the center, but not such good control over the light squared portion. This knight is a very strong piece. So white's next move is geared at putting pressure on the central light squares. White plays the move knight to c3. One example of what might happen if you don't put pressure in the center was actually in a game that I myself played from the black side. White played bishop e3 against me, and after the move castle, white castled, and I took the opportunity, because there was no pressure on my center, I took the opportunity to fortify my knight in the center even more. White did capture en passant, but after queen takes f6, my position was already approximately equal. Notice that if white had a knight on c3, as is the main line, this capture with the queen would not be an option because my pawn on d5 would be falling. Therefore, in the main line, white, rather than castling immediately, or rather than playing moves like castle or bishop e3 immediately, prioritizes the attack on the center and plays knight to c3. Now black continues with castling, and it is only here that white chooses between fortifying his center on d4 with bishop e3, or possibly castling now. Castling is not a bad move, but it does leave the pawn on d4 a little bit more weak than the move bishop to e3, and this gives black possibilities connected with bishop g4. By pinning this knight, black actually threatens to capture on d4. And we see here in this line that it's kind of convenient that the bishop is on b5 because white is able to capture this knight, and after pawn takes c6, the pawn on d4 is no longer under threat. Let's remember that if, let's say, white did nothing here, black could take this pawn because knight takes d4 would lose the queen. So white does have this possibility, and at first sight, it may seem like this is something good to go for as white, because black has doubled pawns, white still has a firm grip in the center, things look good. The problem is all of black's pieces are really active. The bishop points at the center, the knight is central, the bishop is pinning. All of black's pieces are so active, and these doubled pawns are only doubled pawns for the next few moves. Soon, black will aim to play c5, hacking at the center and getting rid of his weak double pawns. So it turns out that this is not such a good option for white after all. Therefore, most of the time, white decides that he will play the bishop to e3 instead, supporting here and staying much more flexible against bishop g4 options. Now, in this position, black has two main choices. I really cannot, as much as I wish, like in the last video, as much as I wish that I could recommend to you one move to play or another move to play, what needs to be said is that these positions are being debated at the highest levels with the best engines, and if two players play them perfectly, it's almost certainly just equal. It's going to end in a draw. And so the way to get an advantage either as black or as white is so subtle and so nuanced that it's beyond the scope of this series. The way, if you want to play this line, you're going to have to really do a deep dive into these positions and use, depending on the level that you're at, use computer analysis, look at a lot of master games, and see a lot of these subtle moves. For now, we will return and we will just show the main ideas in broad strokes, right? So after bishop to e3, we have the move bishop to g4, similar to in the previous line, or here we can also play f5, which is the same idea as I showed in my own game, as I mentioned a little while ago. f5 would support the knight and also in some instances threaten f4, which would dislodge this bishop. And play can continue in a variety of ways, including the move pawn to g3, which would cover the square f4. f5, for me, for my own style, is perhaps the most comfortable move for black. And in my view, it equalizes relatively easily. White actually would probably do best to capture on f6. Now I cannot take back as black with queen takes f6 because the knight takes d5 is happening. But after pawn takes f6, black can actually take on c3, intermezzo, get rid of that knight, and after pawn takes c3, he can play queen takes f6. And this position is roughly balanced. On the one hand, black has this central pawn and active pieces, but on the other, his king, having lost the f-pawn, is a little bit more weak, and white has the possibility of at some point contesting black's center with a pawn push to c4. Also, the pawn on c3 makes the pawn on d4 rock solid pawn, and it leaves this bishop sort of pointing at a brick wall. So, instead of this, I will show what is the most popular way of playing as black. So, after bishop to g4, white now kicks the bishop back. Black is not interested in capturing on f3, so he maintains the pin. White here plays the move queen to c2. Now, this is an interesting move because at first sight, it would seem like after bishop takes f3, g takes f3, white's doubled pawns are not good for him. But in fact, the nice thing about these doubled pawns is, first of all, they force black to a decision with this knight on e4. And if he captures on c3, then after pawn takes knight, this b pawn will suddenly be on c3 and will defend the center. And the second benefit of this is that this pawn on f3 can push to f4 in the future, and so white can build up a really strong center. Finally, the semi-open g file will allow white to build an attack. It is for these reasons that black is not actually interested in capturing on f3 and instead drops the bishop back to g6. From here, black now has threats like knight to g3 with a discovered attack on the queen and a strike against this rook on h1. So white must do something about this, must move his queen, and he goes queen b3. Now there is pressure on d5, and black must try and deal with this. Black defends with knight to e7, covering this pawn. Now, white in the main line, white finally takes the time to castle. So we see that big difference in the main line versus the secondary lines. They're all good, they're all playable, but the nice thing about playing in this way is that white makes black's task in the central light squares a little trickier. It makes it easier for black to go wrong. Now, if black plays correctly, he can equalize or get somewhere very, very close to equality, but it is easier to make a mistake. I should say that not only is castle a possibility, but white could chase after this bishop with the move knight to h4. Many masters have played this move. We won't go into the details, but it's a nice idea for white to try and take that bishop and as a result win the bishop pair, be left with the bishop pair. If you're not quite sure as to why the bishop pair is an asset, then you can see that on the Chessfactor website we have material where we talk about positional benefits, positional advantages such as the bishop pair. So you can find out those videos in the relevant sections. But for now, let's return. After the move knight e7, white, for the most part, makes the decision to castle. And now black will play pawn to c6, supporting on d5 and hitting the bishop on b5. White has to do something about that, and so he drops back to d3. This is a very natural square, though you should notice that the bishop is undefended and it's being x-rayed. So black does have the option of playing the move knight d2. And after knight d2, if knight takes d2, bishop will take on d3 and black has won the bishop pair. White now will play a move like rook e1, and this is the final position that we will consider. Well, on the one hand, black does have the bishop pair, which is often an advantage, but on the other, white has a better central situation. Notice that these two pawns here on d4 and d5 are equal to each other. They're both fourth rank pawns. But white has this pawn on e5, which is in black's half of the board. So he has a better grip over the center. So the battle that will ensue is one where white clearly has a better central situation and potential for very good squares for the knights, squares such as, for example, c5, or after a move like f4, the white knight on d2 can return to f3, versus black's compact pawn structure and the fact that he has not just the bishop pair, but this strong light squared bishop, which is strong because if you look at the placement of the pawns for white, they're all on dark squares. That means there's a lot of potential weaknesses on the light squares, and this bishop can have a big influence on the board. Look at the two long diagonals that it's controlling, and it can restrict the white pieces. This is bringing us to the end of our overview, of our look at the way that the Greco Gambit line is played in modern chess. As I said earlier in the video, at high levels, we need really concrete, computer-backed analysis and subtle ideas. But on the lower levels, I hope that this allows you to play the positions better, either from the white side or from the black side, or indeed, perhaps from both sides. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.